Welcome to Eyes Shut History. Before we get started, if you like the video and you feel you learned something or it sent you straight off to sleep, then please subscribe and leave a comment. It really helps us make these awesome videos for you guys. So sit back, relax, and listen until your eyes shut to history. It begins in the dim light of a hall long since turned to dust, the air heavy with the ghost of incense and the creak of timbers swollen by centuries. The flicker of torches paints shadows that sway like dancers on the stone walls, and 1,000 years collapse into the space between heartbeats. In these rooms, once loud with music and intrigue, kings sat on thrones of carved oak and gilded pride, wearing crowns not merely of gold, but of desires too tangled to speak aloud. We often imagine medieval monarchs as figures locked in their role as rulers, stern faces staring from portraits, clad in armor or velvet, bearing the weight of Christendom and the crown alike. Yet behind these curated images was the warm-blooded truth, men of flesh and craving, whose whims could alter the course of history, and whose appetites spilled from banquet tables into bedchambers, gardens, hunting lodges, and cloisters. Their lusts were not simple pleasures, they were extensions of power, tools of diplomacy, and sometimes the undoing of dynasties. From England, the thread of indulgence weaves its way to the Loire Valley, where Fulk IV of Anjou, nicknamed Le Rechin, ruled with a surly temper and a reputation for appetites that baffled his clergy. Fulk married 5 times, divorcing most of his wives under accusations of infidelity. Accusations some historians suspect were, consider the court of England in the early 13th century, where King John, brother to the lionized Richard the Lionheart, reigned in a cloud of suspicion and disdain. Chroniclers painted him as treacherous, vindictive, and endlessly desirous. Whispered accounts told of noble women summoned to his presence, their husbands away at war or at the king's own table, unaware that the man seated beside them at the feast had already sent for their wives in secret. One chronicler, Roger of Wendover, accused John of seducing the wives and daughters of his barons, sparking a bitterness that fed into the rebellion that would one day force him to seal the Magna Carta. Whether each liaison occurred exactly as told is lost to time, but the collective image of a king more devoted to pleasure than prudence lingered like smoke in the rafters of history, projections of his own wanderings. His chronicler, Orderic Vitalis, described him as given over to illicit love, a ruler whose marital bed was less a symbol of dynastic alliance and more a revolving door. Each union came with its own political entanglements, but Fulk's pursuit of beauty and novelty seemed to eclipse any lasting stability they might have brought. He stands in the annals not as a great conqueror or lawgiver, but as a man who ruled his county much as he ruled his personal life, impulsively, impatiently, and always in search of fresh intrigue. Further east, in the Kingdom of Poland, the 14th century court of Casimir III, remembered as the Great, also earned its share of whispered tales. Casimir was a reformer, a legislator, a man who codified law and sought peace with neighbors. Yet his private life was woven with threads far less orderly. He married 4 times, not all in accordance with the church's blessing, and maintained a known mistress, Kudka, with whom he fathered children. These relationships sometimes overlapped, creating a web of alliances and resentments. Chroniclers accused him of favoring his lovers' families with political appointments and gifts, a practice that blurred the line between royal generosity and favoritism born of desire, and yet even as his bedchamber choices raised eyebrows, his governance left Poland stronger than he found it, a paradox that still intrigues historians. Cross the Alps into the Italian peninsula, and you find yourself in the orbit of Frederick II, Holy Roman Emperor, King of Sicily, and a man both reviled and admired for his unorthodox approach to nearly every aspect of life. His court at Palermo was a melting pot of cultures, Arab, Norman, Byzantine, and his curiosity extended from falconry to philosophy, to the pleasures of the flesh. His enemies called him the Antichrist. His admirers called him a marvel. Frederick's harem, maintained in the style of the Islamic courts he so admired, scandalized papal chroniclers. Rumors abounded of the emperor's taste for elaborate entertainments that mingled intellectual debate with sensual indulgence. Whether exaggerated by his foes or not, these accounts paint a portrait of a ruler whose desires were as wide-ranging as his intellect, and who saw no reason to separate the pursuit of pleasure from the business of empire. In France, the late 15th century brought the reign of Louis XI, a king more often remembered for his cunning and political machinations than for any great scandal of the heart. Yet even here, in the web of espionage and statecraft, whispers of private indulgences surface. It was said he kept a quiet network, not only of informants, but of lovers, whose loyalty was secured as much by intimacy as by coin. The evidence is scant, the stories more shadow than substance, yet they persist, perhaps because we instinctively believe that power seeks outlets beyond the council chamber. And so the story winds from castle to palace, across centuries and borders, threading together men whose crowns gleamed as brightly as the jewels on their fingers, and whose names have been embroidered not just into the banners of history, but into the unrecorded tapestry of human desire. It is a tapestry woven from truths, half-truths, and embellishments, from the words of chroniclers who judged as much as they recorded, and from the enduring fascination we have with those who ruled and strayed with equal vigor. The corridors of history grow warmer, more perfumed as we step into the court of Charles II of Navarre in the 14th century. Known as Charles II of Navarre Bad, his moniker owes more to his political betrayals than to the private pursuits we speak of tonight, yet the two were not so easily separated. His intrigues were as much of the heart as of the crown. Charles's alliances shifted like the wind, and more than one chronicler hinted that his relationships with noblewomen, and even with the wives of enemies, were tools sharpened for the work of diplomacy. To seduce was to disarm, and in a time when the blade and the bed were equally dangerous, Charles wielded both with a steady hand. Beyond the Pyrenees, in the kingdom of Castile, Peter III, called the Cruel by some and the Just by others, ruled in the mid-14th century. His reign was marked by brutality in battle and a complicated love life that wound itself into the politics of his day. Though married to Blanche of Bourbon, Peter quickly abandoned her, choosing instead to live openly with his mistress, Maria de Padilla. This choice not only scandalized his court, but inflamed tensions with France, whose royal family counted Blanche among its own. Peter's attachment to Maria was deep, enduring even through war and rebellion, and yet it was this public defiance of marital convention that lent him a reputation as a man who put personal desire above the delicate scaffolding of European alliances. In England again, the name Edward IV conjures the image of a tall, handsome king, a warrior who secured his throne through force and charm alike. Chroniclers describe him as irresistible to women, and Edward himself did little to curb the stories. His reign in the late 15th century was punctuated by a string of liaisons, some politically advantageous, others simply born of attraction. One tale speaks of his sudden, secret marriage to Elizabeth Woodville, a widow of minor nobility, whose beauty captivated him so completely that he bypassed the usual political match. It was a scandal not because of the marriage itself, but because it revealed that Edward, for all his strategic acumen, could be moved. If we travel further east, we find Vlad III of Wallachia, remembered today as Vlad the Impaler, his brutality overshadowing any other aspect of his life. And yet behind the stories of his cruelty lies a man who understood the power of fear and fascination. Though less is recorded of his personal indulgences than of his battlefield savagery, Contemporary accounts suggest that his court, when not soaked in the blood of his enemies, was no stranger to the pleasures afforded to princes. Guests spoke of elaborate banquets, rich wines, and a ruler whose intensity in all things, whether in vengeance or in intimacy, was unmatched. North again in Denmark, Christian IV ruled for most of the 17th century and left behind not just a legacy of architectural and economic ambition, but a personal life as sprawling as his political one. Christian married twice and took several mistresses, fathering more than 20 children in all. His relationships were often public. His mistresses granted titles and estates, a practice that blurred the lines between royal generosity and royal indulgence. Yet his people loved him, seeing in their king not the cold distance of a monarch, but the warmth and flaws of a man unafraid to live vividly. And then there was Sigismund III Vasa, who ruled both Poland and Sweden in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, while his political career was consumed by the struggle to unite his two crowns. His private life carried its own quiet stories. A devout Catholic in a Protestant kingdom, Sigismund nonetheless found ways to indulge in the more earthly delights. His court in Warsaw was known for its lavish balls and entertainments, where music, wine, and whispered conversations behind velvet curtains wove a fabric of temptation as rich as any in Europe. In these stories it becomes clear that the appetites of kings were not separate from the business of their reigns. Desire could be a tool, a weapon, a weakness, or a solace. It could unite kingdoms through marriage or tear them apart through scandal. It could earn loyalty or breed rebellion. And in the candle-lit rooms where politics and passion met, history was written in more than ink and blood. It was etched in the glances across a banquet table, in the gifts bestowed upon a favored lover, in the quiet arrangements that shaped the fate of nations. And so we continue our slow walk through these corridors where the scent of wine and wax still lingers, and the whispers of the past follow close behind. The centuries turn, and the map of Europe shifts like silk in restless hands, yet the nature of kingship remains the same, power tempered or perhaps sharpened by the pull of human longing. In the great courts of the Holy Roman Empire, desire found its way into every hall, though often under the guise of ceremony. Leopold I, a pious and cautious ruler in public, was in private a man whose family life bore the marks of both deep affection and quiet indulgence. Married 3 times, he fathered a brood of legitimate children and yet was not immune to the allure of beauty beyond the confines of wedlock. His court composers and painters, men like Heinrich Ignaz Franz Bieber and Peter Strudel, created works that celebrated not just imperial glory but the sensual pleasures of life, hinting at the atmosphere of refined temptation that hung in the imperial apartments. Far to the west, in Portugal, João V, known as the Magnanimous, presided over a court so opulent it seemed spun from the gold flowing in from Brazil. His reign in the early 18th century was marked by grand works, libraries, aqueducts, monasteries, but also by a harem of mistresses housed discreetly in a convent. This so-called convent of necesidades became infamous for its dual role as a spiritual institution and the discreet shelter of the king's favored companions. Joan's generosity to these women, showering them with jewels and titles, was a reflection not only of personal affection, but of the Baroque era's taste for blending piety and pleasure in elaborate, if contradictory, displays. In Scotland, before the crowns of England and Scotland were joined under one monarch, James IV walked the narrow line between statecraft and seduction. Charismatic, learned, and a patron of the arts, James was also notorious for his many mistresses. He fathered several illegitimate children whom he acknowledged and provided for, a rare frankness for a king. These liaisons were not without their political edge. Through them, James forged connections with powerful families, binding them to him through ties far more intimate than parchment and seal could provide. If we cross to France once more, the Sun King himself, Louis XIV, offers perhaps the most famous example of a monarch whose romantic entanglements became a kind of theatre. His mistresses, from the celebrated Louise de la Vallière to the formidable Madame de Montespan, were not merely companions but political players in their own right. The glittering court at Versailles revolved around the king's favour, and favour often began in the gilded privacy of his chambers. Yet Louis managed to transform these private indulgences into instruments of statecraft, weaving personal pleasure into the very fabric of his reign, so that even his love affairs reflected and reinforced the majesty of his rule. Venturing into the northern reaches of Europe, the court of Sweden's Gustavus Adolphus in the early 17th century provides a subtler example. Known as the Lion of the North for his prowess in the 30 Years' War, Gustavus carried himself as a devout and disciplined ruler, and yet even he was not untouched by the pull of romance beyond political necessity. Before his marriage to Maria Eleonora of Brandenburg, Gustavus pursued a love affair with Ebba Brahe, a noblewoman whose beauty and wit captured his heart. Their correspondence, tender and passionate, survives to this day, revealing a side of the warrior king rarely glimpsed in the chronicles of war. In the south of Italy, the kingdom of Naples saw its own share of intrigue under Ferdinand I, a ruler whose reign in the late 15th century was coloured by the politics of marriage and the temptations of courtly life. His legitimacy had been questioned from birth, a shadow he dispelled through political acumen and displays of regal authority. Yet behind the public facade, Ferdinand's relationships with noblewomen, often conducted in quiet defiance of propriety, provided both personal satisfaction and political leverage. To know the favour of the king was to hold a key to influence, and in Naples influence was a currency more valuable than gold. From the marble halls of Renaissance Italy to the timbered keeps of the Baltic, we find kings whose crowns sat as lightly upon them in the bedchamber as they did heavily in the council chamber. Sigismund II, Augustus of Poland, ruling in the mid-16th century, was a man whose heart and body rarely moved in separate directions. His great love was Barbara Radziwiłł, a noblewoman whose beauty was sung of in every courtly circle. Their marriage was a scandal, for it defied both his family's wishes and the political calculations of the same. Even as his nobles schemed to annul the union, Sigismund stood by Barbara with a devotion that outlasted her brief life. When she died young, whispers claimed poison had been involved, though the truth lay buried with her. His grief was so profound that it coloured his reign thereafter, and his dalliances that followed bore the shadow of that great loss, reminders that for kings, as for any man, love and desire could be both sanctuary and snare. Southwards in the gilded courts of Spain, Philip IV ruled an empire upon which the sun never set, and yet in his private life he was a man of unquenchable appetite. Chroniclers counted his mistresses in the dozens, his illegitimate children in the scores. He would slip from council meetings to private chambers, where women of courtly rank and actresses alike found themselves drawn into the orbit of his favour. For all his indiscretions, Philip remained a devout Catholic, often turning to confession with the same regularity as to seduction, a paradox that his contemporaries accepted as simply another facet of royal privilege. In Russia, centuries before the Revolution, Tsar Peter the Great reshaped his empire with iron will and restless ambition, and in matters of intimacy with the same sweeping force. His first marriage was a political arrangement, cold and loveless, and he abandoned it for Catherine, the woman who would become his second wife and eventually empress in her own right. But between and beyond these formal unions, Peter's life was a chain of affairs, some public, others hidden in the recesses of palaces along the Neva. His nights could be as wild as his reforms, and those who joined his revels spoke of feasts that blurred into dawn, where diplomacy and desire mingled freely beneath chandeliers. Even further east, in the Ottoman court of Sultan Ibrahim I, desire became the central axis upon which his reign turned, and eventually faltered. Nicknamed Ibrahim the Mad, his rule in the mid-17th century was as infamous for his harem's extravagance as for his erratic governance. He was said to have an insatiable fascination for women, once ordering his officials to find the largest woman in the empire so that she might join his household. His obsessions bled into state affairs, and the coffers of the empire strained under the expense of jewels, silks, and estates granted to his favorites. In the end, it was not only political discontent but the perception of indulgence run amok that led to his deposition and death. Returning westward, the Stuart court of Charles II of England stands as perhaps the most vivid example of pleasure entwined with politics. Restored to the throne after years of exile, Charles brought with him a taste for the libertine culture of continental Europe. His court became a theatre of wit, beauty, and intrigue, where actresses like Nell Gwyn and aristocrats like Barbara Villiers held sway over the king's heart and ear. He fathered no legitimate heirs, but acknowledged more than a dozen children by his mistresses, ennobling several of them. For Charles, the boundaries between governance and romance seemed thin at best, and yet his easy charm and tolerance for dissent kept his throne secure in an age when indulgence might easily have been his undoing. In Denmark again, Christian VII in the late 18th century left behind a reign marked by mental instability and the dramatic love triangle involving his queen, Caroline Matilda, and his physician, Johann Friedrich Struensee. While Christian himself was often absent in mind and will, his erratic affections and inability to assert control over his own household created the space for this affair, which ultimately reshaped the politics of the Danish court. His reign is a reminder that desire, whether actively pursued or simply permitted to bloom in the shadows, could alter the course of nations as surely as war. These stories stretch across time and geography, yet in each one we see the same threads: the crown as a burden, the crown as a lure, the crown as an aphrodisiac. Kings, anointed, armored, enthroned, were still men who sought comfort, distraction, and connection. Some turned to love as a refuge, others as a game. Some guarded their liaisons like state secrets, others paraded them as symbols of their own vitality. Their realms may have been vast, but their desires were often simple: to be wanted, to be adored, to be touched in a world that touched them always with deference and never with tenderness. The chronicles record their deeds in the language of treaties and battles, yet the human story runs in a softer ink, one that seeps into the margins and stains the pages with longing. And perhaps that is why we return to them, not only to measure their laws or weigh their victories, but to glimpse, however briefly, the flicker of the person behind the crown, caught in the same nets of desire and folly as any of us. The torches gutter, the halls fall silent, but the whispers remain, curling through the centuries like smoke, reminding us that even the most exalted figures in history were bound, in the end, by the most human of chains, threading together men whose crowns gleamed as brightly as the jewels on their fingers, and whose names have been embroidered not just into the banners of history, but into the unrecorded tapestry of human desire. It is a tapestry woven from truths, half-truths, and embellishments, from the words of chroniclers who judged as much as they recorded, and from the enduring fascination we have with those who ruled and strayed with equal vigor. The torches of our long corridor dim for a moment, as if the past itself takes a breath before opening the next set of doors. The air grows warmer again, scented faintly with resin and rosewater, and the floor beneath us shifts from cold stone to tiled mosaics, a sign that we have stepped beyond the familiar cloisters of Christendom into lands where desire was clothed in other silks, sung in other tongues, and measured by other rituals. From the palaces of Europe we now walk eastward into the Mughal court of Akbar the Great, who in the 16th century ruled an empire so vast it could swallow the kingdoms we have just left behind. In the public mind, Akbar is remembered as the philosopher-emperor, the seeker of knowledge who convened debates between Jesuits, Hindus, Muslims, Jains, and atheists alike. Yet behind the marble screens of Fatehpur Sikri, his harem was a small city unto itself, peopled by hundreds of women from every corner of his empire and beyond. These were not merely ornaments. Each was a thread in the web of political alliances Akbar wove to secure his realm. The Rajput princesses he married brought their father's loyalty. Persian noblewomen carried the prestige of old dynasties. Others were chosen simply for the spark in their eyes. It was said Akbar would disguise himself to walk the harem gardens at night, overhearing conversations, learning which rivalries simmered among his consorts, for even pleasure in his world was a matter of governance. Beyond the Ganges plain, the Qing dynasty's Kangxi emperor presided over one of history's most enduring reigns. His court in Beijing was a place of ceremony so elaborate that even an affectionate glance had to navigate the protocols of rank. Kangxi's official consorts and imperial concubines formed a constellation of influence, each capable of swaying the balance of the inner court. Chronicles speak less of scandal than of subtle maneuvering. A handkerchief embroidered with a poem, a lacquer box filled with plums in winter, each a token that could whisper favor or foretell dismissal. For Kangxi, desire was folded neatly into the great ledger of imperial stability. Even his pleasures were recorded in quiet brushstrokes by eunuchs who knew the value of discretion. Turn south and the Ayutthaya kingdom of Siam opens its gates. In the 17th century, King Narai reigned over a court that dazzled foreign envoys with gold-leafed palaces, perfumed courtyards, and nights when the moonlight seemed trapped in the polished marble. Narai's harem was famed not just for beauty but for its cosmopolitan mix. Persian, Japanese, and Portuguese women lived alongside Siamese nobility, each bringing her own customs and language into the palace's private quarters. European visitors wrote in awed tones of banquets where dancers' movements told stories older than the kingdom itself, their eyes never meeting the king's, yet somehow making him the heart of every gesture. The line between diplomacy and seduction blurred so completely that even the French envoys, sent to secure trade, suspected their letters home would be scented before they left the palace. We turn westward, across deserts and the Red Sea, to the courts of Ethiopia, where in the early 18th century Emperor Iyasu II ruled from the fortress city of Gondar. His reign, like many in this land of layered dynasties, was steeped in the church's authority, yet Iyasu was whispered to have favored the company of women with a devotion that strained even the patience of his confessors. Chroniclers, cautious in a pious realm, couched their criticisms in metaphors: the lion who lingered too long in the garden, the shepherd whose flock grew restless. Foreign visitors noted that the emperor's feasts could run until dawn, the air heavy with incense and tej, the honey wine of Ethiopia, and that the private quarters into which he retired were guarded more zealously than the city gates. Crossing the Sahara in our imagination, we arrive in the Songhai Empire of the late 15th century, at the court of Askia Muhammad I. Here the grandeur was not marble, but the rich textures of indigo-dyed cloth, gold from the Niger's banks, and the low hum of scholars reciting in Timbuktu. Askia, a devout Muslim, is rarely accused of excess in the records of his reign, but oral traditions tell of a man whose marriages, numbering in the dozens, were as much instruments of statecraft as those of any European monarch. His queens, drawn from influential clans across the empire, secured loyalty in regions that armies alone could not hold. Desire here was less about whispered rendezvous and more about the slow burn of alliance sealed with wedding feasts that lasted days and nights, the drums carrying news of the union farther than any messenger could ride. And yet the pull of the familiar returns, and we find ourselves once more in the Americas, centuries before their kings wore European crowns. In the Valley of Mexico, Moctezuma II presided over the Aztec Empire at the dawn of the 16th century. His palace was a world unto itself, a place of gardens where jaguars roamed, aviaries of exotic birds, and chambers whose walls gleamed with turquoise. The Spanish chroniclers, dazzled and unnerved, claimed that Moctezuma's harem numbered in the hundreds, each woman kept in quarters suited to her origin and status. Whether the number was truth or embellishment, it spoke to the invaders' fascination with a ruler whose wealth and power could be measured in both tribute and affection. Moctezuma's choice of companions was said to follow the cycles of the moon, each night an offering to a different aspect of beauty, fertility, or political necessity. Further south, in the Inca capital of Cusco, Sapa Inca Huayna Capac held court in the early 16th century, his authority stretching from the high Andes to the coasts of present-day Ecuador and Chile. Like his predecessors, Huayna Capac maintained an Aquela Cuna, a house of chosen women selected from across the empire for their beauty, skill in weaving, or noble birth. These women were both sacred and political beings, serving the sun god and, when chosen, the Sapa Inca himself. Marriages and liaisons from this house could bind distant provinces to the imperial center, their children serving as living symbols of unity. Desire in this empire of roads and terraces was a thread woven into the very structure of governance. We could go on, and we will, for the corridors of history have many more doors to open, each leading to a ruler whose reign was shaped not only by battles and treaties, but by the private negotiations of the heart. From the terraces of Cusco, our path winds north and east, and the air shifts, thinner at first, then thick with the scents of sandalwood and cardamom. We arrive in the Vijayanagara Empire of southern India in the 16th century, where Krishna-Devaraya reigned in a court famed for its opulence. The empire's capital was a city of broad avenues and markets overflowing with silk, pearls, and spices. Behind the towering gates of the royal compound lay gardens filled with peacocks and fountains that murmured even in the hottest months. Here, the royal harem was both sanctuary and council chamber, for among Krishna-Devaraya's consorts were women of keen political insight. Chroniclers speak of the poetess Tirumalamba, whose verses praised the king's military victories while also alluding, in delicate layered metaphors, to nights shared in quiet conversation. In Vijayanagara, love and art seemed to grow from the same soil, and desire was as much about the mind as the body. From the southern plains we travel far into the heart of Persia, into the reign of Shah Abbas I of the Safavid dynasty. His 17th century court at Isfahan shimmered with tiled domes and the scent of orange blossoms from palace gardens. Abbas, a master strategist and reformer, also understood the politics of intimacy. His harem was a world of strict seclusion. Yet within it women of Circassian, Georgian, and Persian origin held power in ways the official chronicles rarely named. European envoys hinted at late-night banquets, music lilting through latticed screens, and the Shah's fondness for rewarding beauty with estates and influence. Desire here was wrapped in ceremony, each gesture a performance that could shift the undercurrents of power as surely as a military campaign. Northwest again, across the steppes, we reach the Khanate of Tamerlane's descendants, where memory and myth mingle. In the 15th century court of Ulugh Beg, better known for his astronomy than for conquest, the stars were not the only lights that drew his gaze. Poets in Samarkand spoke in riddles of the Khan's nights, Was he charting constellations, or seeking them in the eyes of a favored companion? The Persian language chronicles, always careful, gave little away, but court gossip carried along the Silk Road insisted that Ulugh Beg's salons were as much about flirtation as philosophy. Here the pursuit of beauty was not indulgence, but part of a worldview in which all creation, from the movements of planets to the curve of a cheek, was worth studying. We descend now into the vast lands of Africa's interior to the kingdom of Benin in the 16th century, ruled by the Oba Esigi. The royal palace, a labyrinth of courtyards and carved wooden pillars, was home to the Eoba, the queen mother, and an array of royal wives whose presence reinforced the Oba's authority. Portuguese traders who came seeking pepper and ivory wrote in astonishment about the scale of the royal household, though their accounts mix fact with the awe of outsiders. It was said that during festivals the Oba would appear in full choral regalia, the women of his household behind him like a living procession of alliances, each marriage a treaty, each glance a reminder of the human bonds that held the kingdom together. From Benin, we leap centuries forward to the 19th century court of Madagascar's Queen Ranavalona I, a ruler whose reputation for ruthlessness has often overshadowed her private life. And yet, within the high palisades of the royal compound at Antananarivo, Ranavalona's choices in companionship carried weight in both politics and rumor. Some claimed she favored young officers from her guard. Others whispered of merchants who brought not only goods but gifts of flattery. Whether truth or invention, these tales reveal a court where affection and survival were intertwined, and where to be noticed by the queen could mean either elevation or peril. We step east again, over oceans, to the Hawaiian Islands in the early 19th century. King Kamehameha II, inheritor of the kingdom his father unified, navigated a world in rapid change, foreign traders, missionaries, and shifting alliances. Hawaiian tradition allowed high-ranking chiefs multiple spouses, and Kamehameha's court reflected both the old ways and the new tensions brought by Christian missionaries. Some of his consorts were women of extraordinary rank, whose bloodlines could rival his own, and their presence in the royal household was as much about safeguarding the kingdom's sacred genealogies as about personal desire. Here, intimacy was inseparable from the maintenance of a cosmic order that tied land, people, and gods together. Across the Pacific, in the imperial palaces of Japan's Heian period, we find a different rhythm of power and passion. The emperors of this era, centuries before our Hawaiian king, ruled more as ceremonial figureheads than as military commanders. Yet their courts were worlds of refined beauty, where the exchange of poems and the scenting of robes were acts heavy with implication. Emperor Ichijo, in the 10th century, is remembered not for conquest, but for the elegance of his court and the rivalries between his empress Teishi and his consort Shoshi. The competition between these women was fought through patronage of literature, each surrounding herself with the era's finest poets and diarists. The resulting works, including the Pillow Book, remain as records of a time when desire was veiled in illusion, but no less potent for being hidden. We turn westward once more toward the Ottoman Empire in the late 16th century and the reign of Murad III. His father, Selim II, had already been known for his indulgences, but Murad took the imperial harem to unprecedented size and splendor. Venetian ambassadors reported that the Sultan preferred the comfort of his private quarters to the field of battle, spending nights in the company of women chosen from across the empire and beyond. Among them was Safiye Sultan, whose influence extended deep into matters of state. For Murad, love and governance were not separate domains. The path from the harem to the council chamber was short, and sometimes the same words, a plea, a promise, could serve in both. And so our walk continues, from marble halls to cedar-roofed palaces, from silk-hung rooms to courtyards lit by oil lamps. In each, the patterns are familiar yet endlessly varied. The crown's weight balanced by the pull of the heart, the affairs of the realm tangled with affairs of the flesh. History may remember the treaties and the battles, but it is in these private rooms that the map of the world was often redrawn.